Winter of 1887 wrapped Iron Creek in a silence so thick it felt alive. Snow lay over the valley like a great white shroud, untouched except where the wind carved sharp ridges and tossed powder into the air like breath. The Hale homestead stood at the edge of the pines, its roof bowed under the weight of ice, its walls creaking softly as if murmuring to the storm. Jonah Hale trudged through knee-deep snow toward the old barn, his son Lucas struggling to match each long stride. Jonah was a broad-shouldered man of 35, the kind whose face looked carved from wind and grief. His voice cut through the howl of the storm, low but steady. "Stay close, now." Lucas nodded, cheeks bright red above his scarf, eyes wide at how the storm seemed to swallow sound whole. The barn loomed ahead, crooked, leaning half-buried under drifts. No one had used it since the fever took Jonah's wife, Mara, years ago. After that, the door had stayed shut, the dust settling over her old tack, and the memories he didn't dare touch. But the blizzard rolling down from the Tetons was getting worse, and Jonah wanted to make sure nothing inside would collapse under weight or wind. We're 15 yards from the barn when Jonah froze. Sound barely more than a shift of straw whispered. Through the wind, he held an arm out. Lucas stopped instantly, trusting his father the way children do when the world is still sharp and simple. Another sound followed. A small rustle, a soft scrape. Jonah stepped forward, boots crunching ice, hand hovering over the old revolver holstered at his hip. The barn door groaned when he pulled it open, a long, aching sound swallowed by the cold dot inside. The air was even colder than outside, dead, stale, and sharp. Frost clung to rafters like lace. A thin line of gray light slipped in through a broken slat, illuminating dust and the faint shimmer of ice on tools left to rust. Then Jonah saw her dot in the far corner, tucked behind a bale of rotted hay. A little girl no more than 3 sat curled tight like a rabbit trying to make itself small. Her tiny dress was ripped at the hem, caked with dirt and snow. Her cheeks were red and raw, and her hands trembled around a broken stick she held like a weapon. Jonah dropped to one knee immediately. The girl flinched and lifted the stick higher, her eyes wild not with confusion, but memory. Fear lived there, old and familiar, etched deep into someone far too young. Lucas gasped behind Jonah, but Jonah raised a hand for silence. The child's breaths came in quick, visible puffs. Her lips trembled as she forced out a rasp barely stronger than the storm outside. "Don't hit me. Mama's dying outside." The words stunned Jonah. They didn't belong in the mouth of a child. This wasn't a runaway. This wasn't accidental. This was a child running from something or someone. Jonah lifted both hands slowly, palms up. "I'm not gonna hurt you," he said softly. "I'm here to help you. We'll find your mama." Her thin arms lowered an inch. The stick wavered in her grip. Only then did Jonah crawl forward. Slowly, quietly, as gentle as settling snow when he reached her. He tugged the wool scarf from his own neck and wrapped it around her tiny shoulders. She flinched, but didn't pull away. "What's your name, little one?" She swallowed, eyes huge. "Emira." Jonah nodded, then glanced at Lucas. "Son, stay behind me." Lucas nodded again, gaze fixed on the trembling girl. Jonah lifted Mira into his arms. She weighed almost nothing, far less than a child her age should. She curled instinctively against his chest, shivering violently. "We're gonna find your mama," he murmured. Outside, the wind slammed into them like a beast. Snow whipped across Jonah's face, stinging like needles. He bent forward, shielding Myra with his coat. Tiny footprints dotted the snow heading north, small, staggering trails that kept fading beneath drifts before appearing again. Whoever left them had been stumbling. "Mira," he said, "can you show me the way?" Her small hand lifted weakly, pointing toward the dark line of pines. Jonah pushed forward, boots sinking deep. Lucas followed close, breath sharp and fast. 50 yards out, Jonah saw a shape, a body, half buried near a pine whose branches sagged under snow. Mira suddenly cried, desperate and broken. Jonah hurried. Heart pounding, the woman lay curled on her side, arms wrapped around herself. Her coat was soaked. One sleeve had slid back, revealing a jagged gash across her shoulder, inflamed, infected, and ugly. Her lips were blue. Her skin was too pale. To still, Jonah knelt in the snow, lowering Mira beside her mother. Mira crawled instantly to her, gripping the woman's frozen hand. "Mama, wake up," she cried. "Please, Mama, I don't need food, I just want you. Please don't die." Jonah pressed fingers to the woman's neck, a pulse, faint but there. "She's alive," he whispered. The woman stirred, breath barely there. Her head tilted slightly toward Mira's voice, though her eyes didn't open. Jonah didn't waste another second. He slid his arms under her, lifting her with a care that felt almost sacred. She was so light it made his chest ache. "Lucas," Jonah said, voice steady despite the storm. "Take Myra, walk right behind me. Stay close." Lucas collected Myra gently. She didn't fight him. She simply curled into his arms, trusting with the last bit of strength she had. Jonah began the long march back toward the faint outline of the cabin, toward firelight, warmth, and whatever chance of survival the night would allow. The storm roared behind them, But for the first time since leaving the barn, Jonah felt something else cutting through the cold, a purpose he hadn't felt in years, a chance not to forget his past, but to save someone else's future. By the time Jonah reached the cabin, his arms burned from the weight of the unconscious woman, and his breath came in harsh clouds that vanished instantly in the storm. Lucas followed close behind, Mira tucked tight in his arms, the little girl shaking so hard her teeth chattered. The Hale cabin stood like a stubborn old sentinel against the blizzard. Weathered, but warm inside thanks to the fire Jonah kept burning low throughout the day. When he shouldered the door open, a gust of wind rushed inside, scattering snow across the floorboards before the door slammed shut with a heavy thud behind them. The warmth hit like another world. Jonah lowered the woman onto the bed, near the hearth. Her face was young beneath the dirt-late 20s, maybe, but gaunt, the kind of worn down that came from more than just the cold. Her hair was tangled, her breath shallow. The wound on her shoulder throbbed beneath the torn fabric, angry and swollen. "Lucas," Jonah said quietly, "get blankets, and the dry socks from the chest." Lucas ran without hesitation, dropping Myra gently onto a blanket by the fire before returning with the pile of warm cloth. Jonah wrapped Myra first, tucking her close to the blaze. Her shaking eased a little, though her eyes never left her mother. Then Jonah turned to the woman. He peeled back the coat carefully, exposing the wound. Whoever tried to stitch it had done the best they could, but the cold and infection were winning. Jonah let out a slow breath. "You've been through hell," he murmured. He set a pot of water near the fire, tossed in strips of clean cloth, and reached for the jar of pine bark and sage mixture he kept for serious wounds. Crushed together, they made a thick paste, sharp-smelling, earthy, and one of the few medicines frontier winters couldn't steal from him. As he worked, the storm outside pounded against the windows, fists of wind slamming the walls. Myra huddled closer to Lucas, both of them wrapped in quilts, watching with eyes too old for their age. "Who is she?" Lucas whispered. Jonah didn't look up. "Don't know yet." But he had a feeling, something in the way Mira clung to her mother's hand, something in the bruises beginning to show along the woman's arm, that, whoever this was, she wasn't lost, she was fleeing, and not from the storm. Jonah spread the pine sage paste across the wound. The woman's breath hitched, though her eyes remained closed. He covered it with clean cloth, tied it tight, then sat back, studying her face. "What's her name?" he asked softly. Myra's voice was tiny. Ruth. Jonah repeated it under his breath. A strong name, a survivor's name. That night, after the storm settled into a steady roar, Jonah sat in the chair beside Ruth's bed. He didn't speak, didn't ask questions. He simply kept her warm and alive. Every few hours he dabbed her forehead with a cool cloth, fed her broth one spoonful at a time, changed the dressing. Myra lay curled beside the fire, wrapped in blankets, eyes heavy but refusing sleep until exhaustion claimed her. Lucas sat nearby, reading softly from one of the few picture books Mara had left behind. His voice was gentle, almost reverent. Jonah watched them, these two children who had found each other. In the middle of a blizzard, Dan felt something shift in the cabin's air. A quiet companionship, a small spark of safety, maybe even hope. By the second day, Ruth drifted in and out of consciousness, murmuring nonsense, half-formed words, pleas, prayers, scraps of memory. Jonah never left her side. By the third day, her mind cleared enough for brief moments of awareness. The first time her eyes fluttered open, Jonah was mixing another batch of medicine. She flinched instantly, arms twitching as if to shield herself. Jonah rose quickly, hands open, voice gentle. "You're safe here," he said. "No one's gonna hurt you." Her gaze darted around the room, frantic, until it found Myra curled on a blanket with Lucas, giggling softly as he handed her a carved wooden horse. Myra's small smile, the first since she arrived, seemed to loosen something inside Ruth. Her breath left her in a shudder. She relaxed. "My daughter," she rasped. "She's fine," Jonah answered. "Warm, fed, and she hasn't left your side until today." Ruth's eyes closed again, but not from fear. From relief. Later that night, Jonah sat in the rocking chair by the hearth, the fire casting shifting gold across the room. Ruth stirred again, turning her head toward him. "I don't know your name," she whispered, voice paper thin. "Jonah Hale," he replied. She swallowed, throat tight. "Thank you, Mr. Howell." "No need for thanks," he murmured. "Just rest." But Ruth didn't look away immediately. She studied him, his steady hands, his worn face, the quiet way he tended the fire and the children without expecting anything in return. Something in her softened. By the next morning, she could sit upright against the pillows. Myra brought her a wrinkled sheet of paper, proudly holding it out. On it, drawn with charcoal, were 4 stick figures: a tall man, a woman with long hair, and 2 children. They stood in front of a small house with smoke curling from the chimney. "That's us," Myra said, tapping each figure. "You and me and Mama, and the man who gives us soup." Ruth stared at the drawing. Her lips trembled, but instead of breaking, she pulled Myra close and kissed her hair. For the first time since the snowstorm, she cried silently, gratefully. That evening, Lucas walked up to her, rubbing the back of his neck. "Miss Ruth," he asked shyly. "Yes, Lucas. Are you gonna stay, like forever?" Ruth's breath hitched. She looked toward Jonah, who was bent over the fire, adjusting the kettle. When he turned, their eyes met his steady, hers uncertain. She looked back at Lucas and touched his shoulder gently. "I can't answer that yet," she said softly. But the boy smiled anyway, because sometimes hope doesn't need certainty, it just needs a door left open. The storm eased by the fourth day. Though winter still clung to Iron Creek with stubborn, icy fingers, frost rimed the windows in delicate patterns, and a hush hung over the land, the kind that settles after days of wind and screaming sky. Inside the Hale cabin, warmth pressed back the cold with the steady glow of the hearth. Ruth Calder woke proper for the first time that morning. Not drifting, not murmuring, truly awake. She blinked slowly, eyes adjusting to the dim morning light that filtered through the frosty glass. Her shoulder throbbed with a deep ache, but the warmth from the quilts soothed it. The smell of broth, pine, smoke, and something faintly sweet filled the air. Her gaze drifted to the corner. Myra sat curled beside Lucas, both clutching small wooden toys Jonah had carved, animals smoothed by years of handling. The two children whispered to each other, heads close, forming the kind of bond that grows naturally between souls who understand fear too early. For a long moment, Ruth simply watched them, the safety of this place pressed against her chest, unfamiliar yet comforting. When she shifted slightly and winced, Jonah, who sat in a straight-backed chair near the hearth, looked up immediately. "You awake?" he said gently. Ruth nodded. Her voice scraped out, rough and dry. "How long?" "3 days since we found you," he answered. "Fever broke last night. Your body's been fighting hard." She swallowed. "And Mira?" He nodded toward the children. "Haven't let her out of her sight, but she's all right. Tougher than she looks." Ruth's shoulders relaxed for the first time in days. "Thank you," she whispered. Jonah stood, bringing her a mug of warm water. His movements were slow, careful, almost uncomfortably kind. Ruth accepted the mug with trembling hands, sipping until warmth spread down her throat. She lowered the cup, eyes fluttering shut briefly. "You should eat something," Jonah said, but slow. He knelt beside the bed, checking a bandage. His fingers were steady, warm, nothing like the rough hands she'd known before. The paste smelled sharp pine sage, and something earthy, medicine from a land that demanded strength. Ruth braced herself as he inspected the wound. "How bad?" she asked softly. "Bad," Jonah replied honestly, "but healing. When infection's easing, another few days and you'll sit up without pain." She breathed out shakily. "You didn't have to do all this." Jonah didn't respond right away. He rinsed his hands in a bowl of water and set it aside before speaking. "No one should freeze alone in the snow," he said quietly. "Not with a child at her side." Ruth looked at him, then really looked. The lines carved across his face spoke of grief and years lived hard, but his eyes held a gentleness she hadn't seen in a long time. A gentleness she had never been allowed to trust. By afternoon, Ruth could sit up for longer stretches. Mira crawled onto the bed beside her, curling into her mother's good side like a sleepy kitten. Lucas offered Ruth a small carved bird, cheeks pink with pride. "I made this one," he said shyly. "Pa showed me how to smooth the wings." Ruth traced the tiny wooden feathers with her thumb, emotion swelling behind her ribs. "It's beautiful," Lucas beamed, then scampered back to Mira, whispering about how he'd carve her a horse next. Ruth watched them for a moment, Myra and Lucas sitting cross-legged, building stories from imagination instead of fear. Warmth filled her eyes. Gratitude, relief. Something close to hope. Jonah stood across the room, mending a torn coat sleeve. He glanced up occasionally, not to intrude, but to make sure she was comfortable. His quiet presence filled the room, steady as the fire. That evening, after Lucas put Myra to bed and the cabin settled into soft crackles and gentle breathing, Ruth pushed herself upright. "Jonah," she said. He looked up from where he sat polishing an old horseshoe. "Yes, ma'am." She shook her head faintly. "Don't call me ma'am, just Ruth." He smiled a little. "All right then, Ruth." A long pause stretched between them, safe, unhurried. "I owe you more than I can repay," she said softly. "You owe me nothing. You saved Mira's life," she said, "and mine." He set the horseshoe down, folding his hands loosely. "I did what anyone ought to do." Her eyes flickered. "That's not true. Not everyone would take in strangers, or listen without questions." Jonah didn't answer immediately. He stared into the fire, jaw tightening, a shadow crossing his features. "My wife," he murmured after a moment, "died slow. Fever took her. There were nights I held her hand and promised she wasn't alone. It was the last promise I ever kept." Ruth's brows knit gently. "After she passed, Lucas..." He stopped talking. "For months. Then one day he climbed onto my lap, handed me a toy, and said, 'Make her another one.'" Jonah smiled faintly at the memory. "That's when I realized I wasn't the only one grieving." Ruth swallowed hard, moved by the tenderness beneath his rugged exterior. "You're a good man, Jonah Hale." He shook his head. "Just a man who's trying." Their eyes met. For the first time, Ruth didn't look away. She whispered, "Thank you for seeing me, for seeing Myra." Jonah's voice dropped low. "Don't thank me yet. You're safe here. That's what matters." Ruth blinked, her throat tight. "Safe?" The word trembled. "Unfamiliar. I forgot what that feels like." Jonah stood slowly, adjusting the blankets around her. Then let this place remind you. Ruth's breath caught at the softness of his voice. And in that quiet, their worlds, two bruised hearts, two lonely paths shifted a little closer. Not love, not yet, but understanding, a beginning, a place to breathe, a place to stay, if fate would allow it. The next morning broke with a pale, tentative light, the kind that slips through thinning clouds after days of storm, not yet sure if it's welcome. Snow still clung to the pines in heavy blankets, but the air no longer carried the biting edge of death. Iron Creek was beginning to breathe again. Inside the Hale cabin, Ruth Calder practiced doing the same. She sat at the small kitchen table, wrapped in a thick shawl Jonah had insisted she wear. Her shoulders still throbbed, wrapped tight beneath fresh bandages. But it was a manageable ache, now a reminder she was alive. Mira sat on the rug by the hearth, stacking wooden blocks with Lucas, their quiet giggles filling the cabin with a music Ruth hadn't heard in years. Jonah moved around the room with a steady presence, tending the fire, checking the stew on the stove, mending a strap on a saddle. His silence wasn't heavy. It was patient, safe. Ruth's eyes followed him without meaning to, watching the slow confidence in every movement. She had known men who talked too loud, who took up space like a threat. Jonah Hale was the opposite. He created space. He softened it. He made room for breath. By midday, Ruth could stand with Jonah's help. He offered his arm without assuming she'd take it. When she did, his touch was warm but respectful. Together they walked the perimeter of the cabin, slow, careful steps that reminded her how long she'd been fighting pain and cold. Snow crunched under their boots. The sky stretched pale blue above the range. Ruth breathed deeply. The air didn't hurt. The world didn't feel like it was closing around her. Jonah paused beside her. You don't have to push yourself. Ruth gave a soft laugh. Standing isn't pushing. You nearly froze out there, he reminded gently. Your body's still catching up. She looked down at the snow, then back at him. So is my mind. He met her gaze but didn't push. That was something she was beginning to trust. Jonah didn't try to fill the silence. He didn't pry. He simply held the moment with her. Inside, Mira barreled toward them when they stepped back in, wrapping her little arms around Ruth's legs. Careful, Myra, Ruth whispered, smoothing her daughter's hair. Lucas came up behind her, shy but eager. Want more tea, Miss Ruth? Ruth smiled, soft, genuine. I'd love some. Lucas grinned and hurried to the kettle. The simple act, the innocence of it, tightened Ruth's throat. She had not been surrounded by kindness for a long time. That evening, Jonah cooked a rabbit stew Myra used to make in winters. The smell filled the cabin, herbs, broth, soft vegetables, and seemed to lift everyone's spirits. The table looked fuller than it had in years as the four of them gathered around it. Lucas, Jonah said, nodding at the boy. Say grace. Lucas bowed his head, Mira copying him clumsily. Thank you for food and warmth, and for Miss Ruth and Myra being safe with us. Ruth blinked fast, swallowing hard. After supper, Mira and Lucas played by the fire while Ruth sat at the table folding a quilt Jonah had repaired earlier. He stood at the counter polishing the last of his tools, an old habit. Judging by how naturally his hands moved, Ruth watched the quiet rhythm of the household, the fire crackling, the children laughing. Jonah's steady presence, a peace she didn't dare name, settled around her, but the peace also loosened things she'd kept bound inside. After a long stretch of silence, Ruth set the quilt down. Jonah, he paused, turning toward her. Yes. Her voice trembled with something deeper than fear. Memory. He used to lock us in the cellar, she said softly. Said the dark taught a woman respect. Jonah didn't move. He didn't interrupt. Ruth stared into the fire, eyes distant. If I talked back, he'd starve. Mira said. One cry from her, one mistake from me, and he'd take her forever. Her breath hitched. So I learned not to cry, learned to take whatever he gave. Jonah's jaw tightened, hands curling slightly around the rag he held. But he stayed where he was. He didn't rush her, didn't press. Ruth turned slowly, fingers trembling as she lifted the edge of her blouse along her injured side. Red, raw ridges crossed her skin, angry scars like cruel handwriting carved deep by Vaughan Mercer's hand. Jonah's breath left him in a long, controlled exhale. Ruth lowered the fabric. I used to pray someone would kill him. Then I prayed for the strength to do it myself. She reached into the pocket of her apron and pulled out a torn photograph that showed her younger, smiling at the side of a man with cold, heavy eyes. Vaughan Mercer. The edges were burned, the image warped by fire and fear. Without a word, Ruth tossed it into the flames. The paper curled, blackened, and folded into ash. Jonah watched the last ember fade before he spoke, his voice low and resolute. If he comes here, he'll find no welcome. He lifted his gaze, meeting hers, and no way out. Ruth's breath shuddered. I don't want to be someone you protect, Jonah. I don't want to be broken. Jonah stepped forward, slow, deliberate, letting her see his hands, empty and steady. You're not, he said. You walked through snow carrying a child. You kept her alive while you were bleeding and starving. His voice softened. That's not weakness. That's strength most folks never know. Ruth blinked, tears clinging to her lashes. But no one, Jonah added, should have to be strong alone. Ruth's knees softened. She gripped the edge of the table, The fire's glow caught the quiet truth in Jonah's eyes, something like respect, something like admiration, something she had never been given freely in her life. She whispered, "Why are you this kind to us?" Jonah's answer was simple, honest. "Because I know what it feels like," he said, "to lose someone you love, and to feel helpless after." Ruth's breath stilled. Two bruised souls, two wounded hearts, two people still standing. Something passed between them, quiet, raw, and real. Not romance, not yet, but the beginning of trust, a fragile thread stretching between them, strong enough to hold. The days passed slowly, gently, as if Iron Creek itself knew this small cabin needed time to mend what winter and men had broken. Outside, the sun began its slow return, melting snow in fragile patches, carving thin runnels of water that trickled past the barn. Spring hadn't arrived, not truly, but its promise hung in the air. Inside the Hale cabin, life restarted in small, steady ways. Ruth could now move about the main room with her arm in a sling, her steps slow but sure. She swept the edges of the hearth, folded quilts, and helped Lucas with his lessons when he stumbled over a word. Myra stayed close to her mother, though the shadows beneath her eyes slowly eased. Replaced by the beginnings of childhood again, it was the first peace Ruth had breathed in years. By the end of the week, when the clouds thinned and the wind softened, Jonah suggested they walk into Iron Creek for supplies. "You don't have to," he said gently, tying his coat. "Town can be curious about new folks." Ruth straightened her shoulders. "Then they can be curious. I'm not hiding anymore." Jonah held her gaze for a moment, then nodded. "All right then, let's go slow." Myra insisted on walking beside her, tiny hand wrapped in Ruth's. Lucas held the other, protective in his own shy, boyish way. Jonah walked ahead, leading the way down the path into town. Iron Creek remained a place carved from dust and residual. Stubborn buildings lined the snow-muddied street, flanked by the saloon on one end and the church on the other. Folks bustled about, going about chores hardened by frontier life. But when Ruth stepped onto the main road, the town shifted. Conversation dipped, eyebrows rose, voices lowered, turned to whispers. Jonah noticed his jaw tightening, fists clenching inside his pockets, but Ruth lifted her chin and kept walking. Inside the general store, the bell chimed overhead. Mr. Thatch, the clerk, looked up from behind the counter. Surprise flickered across his face. "You're staying with Hale," he said, not a question, but an assumption sharpened by curiosity. "Yes," Ruth replied simply, meeting his gaze evenly. For now, her voice didn't tremble. She didn't look away. Jonah stepped behind her, not protective, steadfast. After a moment, Thatch cleared his throat. "Well, what can I help you find?" Ruth gathered flour, soap, cloth scraps for mending. When Myra pointed at a jar of peppermint drops, Ruth gave a small nod, allowing one small handful at the counter. As Jonah began counting coins, Mrs. Jennings, an older woman with silver hair pinned neat, stepped forward from a corner. "You must be Ruth," she said. Ruth braced herself, but Mrs. Jennings crouched in front of Myra, offering her a gingerbread man wrapped in wax paper. "My daughter loved these once. Figured a brave girl like you might too." Myra took it shyly, glancing at Ruth for permission. Ruth nodded. Myra's smile lit up the space. "You've got your mother's spirit," Mrs. Jennings murmured to her. "And her fire, I'd bet." Ruth's breath caught. For the second time in days, her eyes glistened, but not from sorrow, from possibility. When they walked back outside, Jonah walked quietly at her side. "You handled that well," he said softly. "I'm done shrinking," she answered, "and done being afraid of every shadow." Jonah exhaled through his nose, a soft, almost proud sound. Good. The walk back to the homestead was lighter. Myra skipped at times, crunching leftover snow. Lucas swung the small tin pail Jonah let him carry, humming off-key. The mountains glowed pink in the late afternoon sun. But when they returned, Ruth noticed something different, something Jonah hadn't mentioned. The old storeroom had been cleaned, the floor swept, the window repaired, a small rug laid beside the bed, a neatly quilted coverlet clearly hand-stitched spread across it. A shelf hung on the wall with a tiny pine bird Jonah must have carved. Ruth stood in the doorway, hand pressed to her mouth. Jonah stepped behind her, rubbing the back of his neck. "It's not much, but I thought you and Myra ought to have a space that's yours." Her throat closed. "Jonah, you've both been living on borrowed comfort." His voice softened. "You deserve more." Ruth blinked away tears she couldn't hide this time. "You didn't have to do this. I know." Jonah's gaze was steady, not expectant, not demanding. "I wanted to." Ruth swallowed hard. "Thank you. For as long as you want," he said, nodding toward the room. "This space is yours." The next morning, as Ruth hung laundry in the yard, Lucas approached her carefully, arms folded as if bracing himself for something serious. "My mama," he said finally. "She used to sing when she baked." Ruth paused, unsure where he was going. He continued, a bit softer. "You sing too. I heard you yesterday." Her breath caught. She hadn't realized Myra's lullaby had escaped her lips. Then Lucas whispered, "I think she would have liked you." Ruth didn't try to hide the hitch in her breath. She knelt down and gathered the boy into her arms. His small hands clung to the back of her dress with a trust so pure it softened every scar she carried. "That means more than you know," she whispered into his hair. From the porch, Jonah silently watched the moment unfold, his shoulders easing, his eyes turning warm and thoughtful. That evening, after supper, the children played near the fire while Ruth sat beside Jonah at the table. She darned a thin sock while Jonah carved something small from a block of wood. For a long moment, she watched the smooth movement of his hands, the patience of them. Then she reached out and gently laid her hand over his. Jonah looked up, surprised. "I don't know if I deserve this," she said softly. "This peace, this kindness." He turned his palm upward beneath hers, their fingers intertwining naturally. "You don't have to earn safety," Jonah said. "You just need to believe you're allowed to have it." Ruth blinked hard, swallowing emotion. "Thank you for seeing me, for trusting me." "I don't trust easy," Jonah admitted. "But I see the fight in you," Ruth called her. "That's what I trust." Their hands stayed together on the table between them, simple and warm, not desperate, not fearful, just right. In the cabin's glow, with the children's laughter echoing softly, it no longer felt like borrowed peace, it felt like home. The morning of the kidnapping broke like any other, quiet, gentle, deceptively calm. Thin veils of mist curled over the melting snow, and the last of winter clung stubbornly to the ridges beyond Iron Creek. Ruth stood in the kitchen kneading dough slowly, her good hand pressing into the soft mixture with a rhythm she was relearning after years of fear. The steady thump of Jonah's hammer echoed faintly from the barn as he checked tack and railings. Outside, Myra and Lucas played near the porch, their laughter carrying through the air like silver bells. It should have been an ordinary morning, but peace has a way of quieting just before it breaks. Ruth paused, brushing loose strands of hair from her face as she leaned toward the window. Something felt oddly still, the kind of sudden silence that makes a mother's heart twist. "Myra," she called gently. There was no answer. Lucas burst around the corner of the house, panting and wide-eyed, his voice cracked with panic. "Miss Ruth, Mama, there's a man." He took Myra. The bowl of dough slipped from Ruth's hands and shattered across the porch, dough splattering the boards. Cold terror surged through her veins. "What do you mean he took her?" she whispered. Lucas gasped for breath. "He pulled her onto a wagon. He rode off toward the ridge." Black horse. The world narrowed into a single point. A name. A nightmare wearing a familiar face. Vaughn Mercer. Ruth staggered, gripping the porch railing as her knees nearly buckled. Jonah burst out of the barn, bridle still in hand, chest heaving as he looked from her to Lucas. "Which way?" he barked. Lucas pointed toward the tree-lined ridge, hands shaking. Jonah didn't hesitate. He moved like a storm breaking, slinging on his gun belt, boots pounding through mud and leftover snow. But Ruth caught a glint, something pale stuck beneath the porch rail, a scrap of parchment, pinned with a knife. Her heart stuttered. She pulled it free, fingers trembling so fiercely she nearly tore it. The handwriting was jagged, fury etched into every stroke. "You want the girl? Come alone, Ruth, or she dies like her mama should have." Her breath froze. Vaughn had found them. He'd come for Myra. He'd come for her. Jonah snatched the note gently from her hands, his jaw locking as he read it. Then he crushed it in his fist. "You're not going alone," he said. His voice was iron. Ruth shook her head fiercely. "If he sees you, I don't care what he sees," Jonah cut in. "You're not facing that monster by yourself." Tears threatened to spill, but she swallowed them. "Jonah, he'll kill her." Jonah stepped closer. "You're not alone anymore, Ruth, not ever." The finality in his voice left no room for argument. They saddled their horses fast, Lucas watching with trembling hands, tears streaking his cheeks. Ruth knelt before him, cupping his face. "You did right. You're brave," she whispered. He hugged her tight. "Bring her home, I will." Night had begun to fall when Jonah and Ruth rode into the woods. The moon hung low, pale and ghostly behind drifting clouds. Snow crunched under hooves as branches creaked overhead, whispering secrets of danger. Jonah rode ahead, rifle slung across his shoulder. Ruth followed close, heart pounding so violently she feared it might give her away. Every tree felt like a shadow where Vaughn might lurk. And then, in a clearing deep in the pines, light flickered a fire. A figure, Vaughn Mercer, stood beside the flames, swaying slightly, a bottle in one hand, revolver gleaming in the other. His coat was torn, his beard unkempt, his eyes wild with rage and whiskey. Myra sat on the ground near him, arms tied, cheeks streaked with tears. When she saw Ruth, she cried out, "Mama!" Ruth slid off her horse, shaking violently. "I'm here, baby. I'm here." Vaughn's lips twisted into a cruel grin. "So you came, and you brought your hero." Jonah stepped forward, voice cold as steel. "Let the girl go." Vaughn laughed. It rang sharp across the clearing. "Not until I get what's mine." "You never owned her," Ruth snapped. Her voice trembled, but she stood tall. "You never owned either of us." Vaughn's wild eyes snapped toward her. He shoved the gun in Myra's direction. "Don't test me, Ruth." Jonah lifted his rifle. "You shoot her, you die where you stand." Vaughn's voice slurred, bitter. "You think she loves you, hey? You think she's yours? She's mine." Always was. Suddenly, without warning, Vaughn swung the barrel toward Ruth. Ruth! Jonah shouted what Myra screamed. Ruth lunged, throwing her body in front of her daughter just as Vaughn pulled the trigger. The gunshot cracked through the trees. Pain tore through Ruth's shoulder, the same shoulder that had barely healed. She cried out, collapsing, but her arms wrapped around Myra, shielding her with every ounce of strength left in her. Jonah's rifle fired a split second later. A scream tore through the clearing as Vaughn went down, shot through the leg, his revolver flying into the snow. Jonah was on him in an instant. He kicked the gun away, then used his belt to bind Vaughn's hands behind his back. The man writhed, cursing, spitting, laughing in manic bursts. Ruth groaned, collapsing to her knees as Myra clung to her. "Mama, no, don't die," Myra sobbed. "Don't leave me." Ruth tightened her arms, breath shaking. "I'm here. I'm right here." Jonah ripped his shirt into strips and pressed them to her wound. "Stay awake, Ruth. I've got you. Just breathe with me." Tears blurred Ruth's vision as she met Jonah's eyes, steady, fierce, terrified for her. "I thought he'd take her," she whispered. "I won't let anyone take either of you," Jonah said, voice ragged. "Not ever again." Myra's tiny hand reached for Jonah's, gripping tight. And in that frozen circle of trees, blood, firelight, snow, the three of them clung together. A family forged in fear. A family saved by love. A family Vaughn Mercer would never break again. 10 minutes later, lanterns danced through the shadows. Sheriff Barnes and 2 deputies rode in fast, drawn by the gunfire. Justice had finally arrived, but the real saving had already been done by Jonah, by Ruth, by love stronger than fear. The clearing slowly emptied of danger, but the fear lingered in the branches like frost. Vaughn Mercer lay in the snow, bound and howling curses, the deputies hauling him upright after Jonah had identified the man responsible for the kidnapping and attempted murder. Sheriff Barnes spat on the ground beside Vaughn as he was dragged away. "I'm tired of men like him," Barnes growled. "Iron Creek's had enough of his kind." Jonah barely heard him. All of his focus was on Ruth, pale, bleeding, trembling, her arm wrapped around Myra like nothing else mattered. Myra clung to her mother fiercely, her sobs quieting only when Jonah pressed firmer against Ruth's shoulder to slow the bleeding. "You're safe now," he said, voice low, steady, almost a whisper meant only for her. "Both of you." Ruth's breath puffed weakly in the cold air. "It's just the shoulder again," she managed through clenched teeth. "I can walk. You don't need to prove anything," Jonah murmured, lifting her gently. "Lean on me." As he supported her, Ruth let her forehead rest briefly against his chest, a gesture both unconscious and painfully intimate. He held her tightly, steady as stone, while Myra wrapped her arms around her mother's waist from the other side. Only when Jonah was sure Ruth wouldn't collapse did he help her climb onto his horse. He swung up behind her arms, firm but gentle as he pressed his coat around her. Myra rode with Lucas on the other horse, clutching his coat like a lifeline. As they began the slow ride back toward the homestead, Ruth turned her head slightly, voice faint. "You didn't have to come," she whispered. Jonah's breath clouded in the cold. "I lost one family once," he said, voice rough, honest. "I'm not losing another." Ruth's heart trembled at the word family spoken with such quiet conviction, as if he hadn't even realized he'd said it aloud. Myra heard too. She reached back and pressed her tiny hand on top of Jonah's on the reins. In that simple gesture, the last remnant of winter loosened its grip. 3 days later, winter sun streamed through the cabin windows, warm, almost golden against the log walls. The Hale homestead felt different now, full of a deeper sort of quiet, not the emptiness that had haunted it for years, but a peaceful hush shaped by healing and safety. Ruth lay in Jonah's bed, her arm wrapped in fresh bandages, pain dulled by rest in the herbs Jonah mixed twice a day. Myra lay curled at her mother's side, dozing softly. Across the room, Jonah sat near the fire with Lucas, carving what looked like a small wooden dough. Ruth stirred, and Jonah immediately looked up. "You awake enough for broth?" he asked gently. She smiled weakly. "I think so." Lucas hurried over with the bowl. "PA says this'll make you stronger." "Thank you, sweetheart." Ruth brushed his hair back with her good hand, marveling at how easily he smiled now, how safe he felt beside her. After Lucas returned to the fire, Ruth reached out toward Jonah. "You don't have to do all this," she whispered. "I know you have your own burdens." Jonah leaned forward, resting his hands on his knees. "I know," he said softly, "but I want to." Their eyes held a quiet understanding stretching between them, a promise without words. A week after the clearing incident, Ruth felt strong enough to make a trip into town again. She stood on the porch of Iron Creek's general store, Myra's hand snug in hers. Her shoulder still ached, but she stood tall. When the bell chimed overhead, the townsfolk looked up again, but this time, their stares held something different. Recognition, respect, something like compassion. Mrs. Jennings appeared from behind the counter, eyes warm. She bent down with a smile and handed Myra another small gingerbread man. "Another for the brave girl," she said. "And for her brave mama." Ruth swallowed, the gesture hitting deeper than she expected. "Thank you, ma'am." "Welcome to Iron Creek," Mrs. Jennings said simply. "Seems you've earned a place here." Others nodded too quietly but genuinely. "Good to see you out, Miss Calder. Heard you stood between your girl and danger. Strong woman, if you ever need anything, you ask. Ruth stood a little straighter with every word. Iron Creek wasn't just tolerating her, it was welcoming her. Outside on the porch, she paused, the sunlight glinting on melting snow. For the first time in years, she felt no urge to run. Spring began unfolding over the land in earnest, snow softening, plum blossoms budding along the fence line. Jonah hammered a horseshoe at the forge while the children played in the yard, Lucas galloping with his stick horse, Myra chasing behind him with Jonah's oversized hat bouncing on her curls. On the porch, Ruth mended a shirt, the needle moving in steady, confident strokes. Her eyes drifted often toward the yard, toward the life blooming before her. She caught Jonah watching her too, just a quiet glance, but it warmed her more than the fire in the forge. That evening, the dinner table glowed with candlelight. Lucas chatted about school. Myra told a story about adventures with Lucas's stick horse. Jonah refilled mugs with cider, shoulders relaxed, eyes soft. After the meal, when the children dozed beside the fire, Ruth reached into her apron. I wrote to my sister, she said, offering a folded letter to Jonah. Would you take it into town? Jonah took it gently, but she hesitated. Will you read it? She asked. He opened it, gaze drifting over the softly written words. Dear Clara, it's been too long, but for the first time in years, I'm not afraid to sleep. When I open my eyes, someone is here. And this place, it's not just safe, it feels like home. Jonah looked up slowly. Ruth's eyes were steady. No fear, just truth. He reached for her hand across the table, their fingers intertwined as if their hands had been waiting for this moment. You didn't just survive, Ruth, Jonah murmured. You fought, and now, you're building something new. Ruth's breath trembled, not with fear this time, but with something deeper. I didn't think I deserved a life like this, she whispered. You always did, Jonah answered. You just needed a place that knew it. She leaned into him, her head resting gently on his shoulder as the fire warmed the room. Outside, the land thawed. Inside, hearts did too. For the first time, Ruth dared to imagine a future not running, not afraid, not hidden. A future where she stayed. A future built beside Jonah Hale. A future where love, real quiet, steady love, could grow. Night settled over Iron Creek with a softness that felt almost unreal to Ruth, a gentle quiet, not the suffocating silence she had once known. The hearth in the Hale cabin glowed low, its amber light dancing across the wooden walls. The children lay curled together on a quilt by the fire, Lucas's arm draped protectively over Myra's small hand gripping his shirt like he might drift away in her sleep. Ruth watched them with a heart so full it ached. Jonah sat beside her on the settee, a wool blanket draped over both their shoulders. Their hands rested together in the warm space between them, fingers intertwined without either of them remembering exactly when the gesture began. It had simply happened, born from quiet trust and steady presence. The cabin felt different now, not Jonah's home with two guests, but a home shared. Hold. Ruth broke the stillness first, her voice low. I ran for so long, Jonah. I thought I'd die with my boots in the snow before I ever knew peace. Jonah's thumb brushed gently over the back of her hand. You didn't run, Ruth. You survived. Her gaze flicked to the fire. Sometimes I still feel him behind me, even though I know he's gone. Jonah shifted closer, not crowding her, but offering quiet strength. He can't hurt you. Not anymore. Not here. Ruth breathed deeply, the tightness in her chest easing with each breath. She leaned her head against his shoulder, her cheek brushing the soft cotton of his shirt. You saved us, she whispered. Jonah shook his head softly. You saved each other. I just, helped light the fire. A small smile tugged at Ruth's lips. You did more than help, Jonah Hale. He didn't argue, but his hand tightened around hers just slightly. The kind of silent acknowledgement that meant more than words. In the days that followed, the land around the homestead began to thaw. Snow melted into trickling streams, soaking into rich earth. Birds returned, sparrows, finches, even a hawk circling high above the ridge. The barn's roof shed its icy load, and the fields beyond glistened with hints of green. Spring had begun. Ruth moved more easily now. Her shoulder healed steadily under Jonah's careful tending. She cooked more, sang more, even laughed small at first. Then, with a gentle confidence that made Jonah pause in his work when he heard it, something warming deep inside him. One afternoon, Ruth stood by the window, watching Myra help Lucas feed the chickens. The children's laughter carried across the yard. Jonah stepped inside behind her, wiping sweat from his brow after splitting wood. She turned, offering him a soft smile. They look happy. Jonah nodded, following her gaze. They are, and you? She asked quietly, the question heavier than it seemed. Jonah hesitated, not because he didn't know the answer, but because he wasn't used to being asked. I am, he admitted, more than I've been in a long time. Ruth's breath hitched ever so slightly. Me too. Their eyes met, and the space between them felt charged with something new, something fragile but inevitable, like the first bud of spring breaking through thawed soil. Jonah cleared his throat, glancing down at his hands. I don't want to overstep. I don't want to push. Ruth stepped closer, lifting her hand to rest lightly on his chest, over the heartbeat that had steadied her through pain. Through fear, through nights she couldn't quiet her mind. "You're not pushing," she whispered. "You're here, and that's what I want." Jonah covered her hand with his warm and steady. "I meant what I said that night in the woods. You're not alone." Ruth called her. "Not now, not ever again." Her eyes glistened with something soft relief, trust, maybe even the earliest flicker of love. Weeks passed. Iron Creek embraced Ruth as one of its own. Folks nodded warmly when she entered the general store. Myra played with children near the church steps. Lucas walked proudly beside her, protective and bright. The past no longer followed her like a shadow. It faded, still there, but quieter. A story she survived, not a prison she carried. One warm evening, Ruth returned from town with a new piece of fabric for quilting. She pushed open the cabin door and paused. Jonah was at the table, whittling a small wooden figure, a mother holding a child. The carving was delicate, careful, made with a tenderness so deep Ruth felt her breath catch. He looked up, startled. "I wasn't finished. I didn't mean for you to see it yet." Ruth stepped closer, her heart swelling. "It's beautiful." Jonah rubbed the back of his neck, flustered. "I thought Myra might like it." Ruth lifted the figure gently, tracing its curves. "And me," Jonah swallowed, voice low. "You too, if you want it." She set the carving down, stepping close enough that their breaths mingled. "Jonah," she whispered, "I want more than a carving." His eyes softened in a way she hadn't seen before, hopeful, uncertain, wanting. "Ruth," he said, voice trembling slightly, "are you sure? You've been hurt. I don't want to be another weight on your shoulders." She reached up, cupping his cheek. "You're not weight," she murmured. "You're home." Jonah exhaled shakily, and in that breath the years of loneliness, grief, and quiet longing melted. Their foreheads touched. Ruth closed her eyes. Jonah lifted a hand to brush a strand of hair from her face, fingers trembling with care. No kiss. Not yet, just closeness, just truth, just two hearts finally allowed to stop running. Later, as the fire glowed warm behind them, Ruth sat beside Jonah on the porch, Mira asleep in her lap, Lucas leaning against Jonah's side. The sky stretched purple and rose over the fading winter fields. Ruth whispered softly. "He found a little girl alone in a barn." Jonah smiled faintly, "and found more than he ever expected." Ruth leaned her head on his shoulder. "He found a reason to hope again." Jonah rested his hand over hers. "And maybe," he murmured, "a chance at love." Ruth closed her eyes, letting the peace of the moment fill every hollow place inside her. Not just safe, not just sheltered. Home. At last,